So now we're really excited to also introduce John Levinson, who this forum would not be possible without him. So we're gonna welcome him to the stage to give a couple brief comments before we launch into our keynote.
Thanks, Erica. Oh, great. So why hold a forum on ethics? Well, I want to give you a brief story about how it got started. I've had 3 careers over the past however many years since I graduated from GSIA, or now Tepper, in 1980. The first one was at Goldman Sachs, where I was a securities analyst for 13 years. Then I started a hedge fund and had a hedge fund business during the dot-com boom. It was a tech-focused hedge fund. It was wild. And the last 20 years, I've been investing in startup companies as a venture investor and an advisor and board member to a number of those companies. I've seen a lot. And what really made me want to focus on ethics is, while I've seen gray area ethics, clear what I thought was an ethics violation, and indeed a number of situations that turned out to be pure fraud and illegal, as the courts proved, I thought this was something I wanted to look at broader. So I looked at my venture investing, and it was 60-some companies. And I looked at my greatest successes and my greatest failures. And I found a common thread, not running between them all, but running between a group of them. Companies that failed, or really failed to live up to what they should have been, in my opinion. And in most cases, that failure was related to ethics or corporate governance that was poor, subpar, less than acceptable. It made me want to dig a little deeper. One of the companies I was invested in was Theranos. I was a very early investor in Theranos. Turns out it was 6 or 7 years before Erica joined the company. And I was also an advisor, a personal advisor, to Elizabeth Holmes, meeting with her monthly for 2 years, and with the chairman, Don Lucas. I experienced a lot through that. Several years after Theranos was done, was out of business, I decided to contact Erica. I'd never met her before. And I learned about ethics and entrepreneurship and got excited about some of the things she was doing. And I began to think about it, and I've had a long connection with Tepper since my graduating. And I thought this would be a good idea to do something more than just have Erica come and give a talk about whistleblowing at Theranos. It's a deeper topic than that and deserves more. And a year ago, I met Taya Cohen. Had a 15-minute meeting with her, but I said, in 15 minutes, we'll figure out if we have something that's going to work or not. And she got excited, I got more excited, and I connected her and Erica, and those two together, with the support of other people for sure, but those two together have driven this thing, and I'm very excited to witness it come to life today. Now I want to turn a little bit and introduce our keynote speaker, Karthik Krishnan. Karthik is a venture capitalist at Redesigned Health, an organization that I know pretty well. And I was introduced to him not too long ago, but I've learned he's, in many ways, a perfect person to sort of set the stage for us today. He's got a long history of working with different companies in technology. He was the CEO of Britannia Group, which we think of the Encyclopedia Britannia, but it's much broader than that. He may touch on that. He's got many years' experience at senior levels in nonprofit organizations, board members, and running projects. And he's a professor, another NYU professor. We'll see more of them today. 11 years as an adjunct professor. So let me stop and open it with, turn it over to Karthik, and you can, here's the flipper.
Thank you, John. What a roller coaster ride the first 2 decades of the 21st century has been. We've inherited a world and also shaped a world that's both frustrating and fascinating. Fascinating because for the first time in the history of humankind, we have connected the far corners of the world. Information travels at the speed of light or probably at breakneck speeds, really creating one planet where we can all stay together. That's super fascinating. The second piece, knowledge and skills have become free. 20 years ago, I had to go into a library, wait for a book to get my knowledge. I might be 5 deep in that book stack and have to wait for that book. Today, by the click of a mouse, I can go there and get any information that I want. I can build any skills that I'm looking for. And that life is only going to get easier. I'm sure you've heard of ChatGPT. I don't even have to search anymore, right? It's going to curate all the world's knowledge and deliver it into my screen, or probably into my Google Glasses, or a patch that I'm going to be wearing on my skin. This is fascinating. Most of us have a device that's stuck somewhere like within a 2 feet radius from us, which is a smart device, right? That device is going to help us FaceTime a loved one that's sitting in Australia, work from home, and more importantly, tweet the Elon Musk of the world or any CEO, and those people are going to respond to us. A fact that has never happened before. We finally have a voice. From that perspective, the 21st century has been super fascinating. The frustrating part comes from a few things. Look at the number of climate catastrophes that we've had. The number of 100-year floods to fires to running out of water in many cities has become a commonplace. Second, when you think about these climate catastrophes, the next piece is economic uncertainty. We started the 21st century with the dot-com burst. That was fine. In 2008, we also created a Wall Street versus Main Street type of situation by putting out securities that were too complex for even experts to understand what was happening. We nearly brought the country to the brinks of collapse at that point. It really tells you that, that creates frustration. And last but not the least, when you think about the social justice and other situations that we've been facing, COVID has been a huge, huge eye-opener for us. What started out as a public health crisis, for the first time in the history of humankind, every country, every person was facing a common enemy, COVID. It has never happened before. I expected the best minds in the world to come across, work together to find a solution. Instead, what happened? Everybody was on a vaccines race, right? Who do we get there first? Who gets the vaccine first? Those are the kinds of things that we have created. And what began as a public health crisis quickly transformed into a political crisis, an economic crisis, a social justice crisis, and a mental health crisis. All these things indicate that our lives are hanging by a thread. And we got to fix it. If not, anything can break, and these systems are so complex and interconnected today, having ripple effects that none of us can actually foresee. 21st century is truly what we call the VUCA world. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. If we have to shape a brighter future for all, we have to move from taking that volatility and converting that into vision. How do you take that uncertainty and convert that to understanding? How do you take that complexity and convert that into clarity? And how do you take that ambiguity and convert that into agile execution? We have to do it at a pace that we've never done it before. So the question I have for all of us is, with all these factors that are looming, how do we work towards balancing people, planet, and profit? This can be done. And we definitely have the tools and the capabilities to make it happen in our lifetimes. So now I'm actually going to quickly move into businesses in general. Businesses are a key factor in terms of bringing communities, people, opportunities together. They are an amazing social fabric, but they have two sides. When things are done well, business has the potential to benefit customers, right? You can actually create new products and services. Zoom, how many of you have worked from home in the last 2 years? A number of you, right? That would not have happened if you had not created those kinds of services. So from a customer point of view, businesses are able to create net new value and everything from the smartphones to working from home and all the benefits that we have today are on the backs of those products and services that have been created. From an employee perspective, we got to find a way to keep 8 billion people on the planet engaged, occupied, and economically productive. That's a challenge. If you don't have businesses, that challenge is never going to be met. The third piece is communities. Businesses have been a growth engine for communities. Think about Pittsburgh here, like you got UPMC, the number of people it hires. It actually invests in the community. It's providing services. So businesses can be an integral part of communities and have a huge impact. And finally, shareholders. As people are investing in these businesses, they get a reasonable rate of return, right? That allows them to invest in other businesses as well. That's the positive side of businesses. But of course, there is also another side of businesses that creates harm. We need to understand that because everything in today's world, right, has positive and negative things that are happening. From that perspective, customers, faulty products. When you have a car that's actually not functioning as designed, that is a faulty product. Willingly knowing it and putting it out in the marketplace creates harm. If you look at it from an employee perspective, social and economic inequalities, gender pay gap is something that we've been talking about, right? These are things that are happening. The CEO salaries are much higher as a multiple of an average employee's salary. That's inequality. From a community perspective, there are businesses that are knowingly damaging the economy and creating destruction. Part of it is because it's not going to happen in my lifetime. If you're going to run out of water, I don't care about it now because I have enough water coming through the aquifers for me to run my business for the next 5 years and 7 years. Nobody is thinking on long-term horizons. Finally, from a shareholder point of view, there are people like John who invested in Theranos because it was the absolute right thing to do. That said, these people have been disappointed because the business did not actually deliver on that promise, and all of a sudden, hype became deception. So from our perspective, I think it's important for us to balance both sides. We do need businesses. They can create amazingly really good value for the community, the people, and the employees. On the other side, when not done right, they have an oversized impact on all these factors that we're looking at. What I would love to do next is actually go through 3 or 4 cases where there has been economic damage, environmental damage, and social damage. How many of you have heard of FTX? Everybody here, right? It's simple business. It's the New York Stock Exchange for cryptocurrency world, right? I'm sure the experts here can actually confirm or deny that. But from our perspective, why is this business so complex? I mean, we've been running a New York Stock Exchange. We've learned a lot from that organization running. Why can't we apply those standards as we actually put these things in place? Yet, what happened? There was $1.8 billion of money raised in a period of 4 years, which is a lot of money. And then Fortune had SBF as the next Warren Buffett, right? I mean, this is somebody like, if you think about the Oracle of Omaha, he's one of those people who still rises a court. He's focused on shareholder value. In fact, I have a friend, a boss of mine who shared a story with me. He was in California, and this lady was stuck at a McDonald's. Her car wasn't working. And this old man walks up, helps her with a car. She did not know it was Warren Buffett, right? And my boss said, like, Karthik, this lady had no clue, but this man actually looked at the situation, knew that he could help somebody, walked in and helped that person. And here you have somebody like SBF being compared to the Warren Buffetts of the world, the Oracles of Omaha. What he had is the right thing, right? People always get gravitated towards personalities and other things, right? But at the same time, are they doing this in an ethical way is a question that we need to have. At the peak, FTX had a valuation of $32 billion. That's a lot of money. Tell me, for somebody who works in that organization, would they have not figured out that having places in the Bahamas, having no accounting, not even an auditing firm, is a red flag? We all knew those things, right? But sometimes people choose to turn a blind eye. I mean, the Sequoias of the world had invested in that firm. I'm sure when investors going into a company, they do something called due diligence. There are so many things that have come out. But at the same time, when people are excited about something, it's like saving the world, creating cryptocurrency, decentralized finance. These are things that really speaks to our emotion. And sometimes logic takes the backseat. It's no different, right? When your son or your daughter is going through something, we sometimes feel that we step in and support, even though in some cases we know what our children are doing is so wrong. That kind of mentality can permeate into organizations as well. So here, they actually took the money that investors had put in to actually buy stuff and used that to fund other things. And the best part was they required Alameda Ventures to keep their money back in FTX. So all of a sudden, they're kind of giving money but not giving money because everything stayed here. All of a sudden, you have this little asset that's actually supporting multiple businesses, and that's a very dicey situation. If nothing else, we should have learned about that from the collateral debt obligations or the CDO issue that we had with mortgage-backed securities. So here, this is a classic example of not only failure of corporate controls, but leadership ethics. The next one I would love to talk about is Theranos, right? I mean, you have Erica here. Who would not get excited about being able to draw a small sample of blood from our skin and all of a sudden be diagnosed for different diseases, but can also help with therapy so that you have something like personalized medicine? If I were to ask any one of you here, I would say most of us would put our hands up to work on something like that. It's pure, it's exciting, it's about the future. And let's not face it, right? Let's face it. Science on the bleeding edge is revolutionary. I mean, you have hope, you keep pushing it, and you keep pushing it until you find a solution. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to go down the path and come back and say, I failed. But where things take a turn is when you actually start telling people a story, even though you know that's not the story. It's okay to come back and say it's not working. I'm actually have 3 other ways to make it work. That's a different conversation as opposed to telling people that this is working and actually doing things in the background to go back and say, hey, John, you got your test results from Theranos in like 5 minutes and it's been done outside in another lab. Or worse, in most cases, that result was not even accurate. So imagine the agony and the harm that person is going to go through when he or she gets a medical test which is not right. And there's a whole slew of physicians who are making decisions based on that key critical piece of information. As you know, Elizabeth Holmes was touted to be the Steve Jobs of the world, right? The next Steve Jobs with the way she worked and all that stuff. $10 billion in peak valuation, $700 million of money that was raised from different investors. And it took a young, courageous woman from Berkeley to actually look at this and say, something is not right here. She had the courage. How many of us have the courage to stick our necks out and say, you know what, let's do the right thing? There's difference between be right versus do right. And in ethical situations, it's hard for somebody to step up and do it right. But until we do that, things like these will continue to happen because we are enabling them and empowering people like this. Here, this was a classic example of a false product claim, right? The product never existed and could have worked, and did not. It's not just the new age companies that we're looking at. If you look at traditional companies like Volkswagen, which has been around for like multiple decades, we all know what happened with the defeat devices that they put in almost like 11 million diesel vehicles. Tell me, if you're part of Volkswagen, there are sensors involved, there was software written to actually defeat these emission tests. Isn't it highly likely that a good portion of the population within Volkswagen knew about this? Why didn't they ask the question, why are we writing the software? And ultimately, it came out because the data, this is where big data and technology can help. They actually looked at that data and found that these devices did not have that diesel engine did not have the same level of efficiency in the last 50 years. And all of a sudden, it kept going down and down and down like that. That was the early trigger on why they figured out this was happening. So from our perspective, in this case, Volkswagen violated the Clean Air Act. Their pollution levels were 40 times higher than emission standards allowed. It's crazy. And ultimately, the cost of the settlement, $15.3 billion, right? Based on everything that they had to pay. I'm going to put this in perspective. We all start a company we think that you're going to be a unicorn. But now everybody's a unicorn, right? So everybody wants to be a decacorn, right? Which is like $10 billion or more. There are 195 countries in the world today. If you look at the data, 75 countries, which is 38% of those countries, have a GDP, I'm sorry, it says GSP for some reason, it's GDP, of less than $15 billion. So what we are trying to do with these new companies and other things that we're trying to launch is to create things that are equivalent to launching a country with $15 billion of GDP. But what happens in most cases? Companies pay a fine and move on, and people go back and buy those products as well. So the next one is McDonald's. This was probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. There's this massive case going on because the chief people officer, David, at McDonald's was known for promoting what is called a party atmosphere, right? Where there was a whole lot of relationships going on, improper relationships, sexual harassments, and other things. He kind of turned a blind eye. In fact, the previous CEO, Estabrook, was actually let go because of a relationship that he had with somebody on the team. The shareholders sued the company because this was something that they should have been aware of. And the case was, hey, I'm the chief people officer. I'm not on the board, which means I don't have fiduciary responsibilities. So this person was trying to hide behind the legal act to say, I don't have fiduciary responsibility, so you can't come behind me. Right? And 2 weeks ago, the court in Delaware ruled that, you do have fiduciary responsibilities. This is going to be a landmark case that really changes how corporate America is going to look at these things going forward. If you're in a leadership role, whether you're on the board or not, you should have fiduciary responsibility. Imagine your own family being in that environment, being abused. Would you allow that to happen? So why do we have to wait for regulation to step in and tell you what's the right thing to do when it's pretty obvious? It's not even an ethical dilemma in this particular case. What you're seeing in front of you is so black and white, this has to be done. So in this particular case, it's not only unethical behavior, but the person tried to hide behind the legal veil, right? Because people look and say, as long as I'm doing by law, I don't have a responsibility here, right? It's easy to turn a blind eye and walk away. When you do those things and people continue to do that, it has a huge impact on our lives. It's not only happening in big companies. How many of you have heard of Frank? Great. Looks like Charlie Javis here, kind of promised people to say that, we'll get you twice the amount of financial aid as you go through college. And as you know, with $1.8 trillion in student loan, financial aid is something that's significant that most families need. Here, she actually convinced JP Morgan Chase to buy this organization. And after they bought the organization, they found that there were almost like 4.3 million records that were fabricated. They even went to the level of actually creating data using AI and other technology that's available today to make it look real. Because coming up with fake data is one thing, but coming up with something that makes it look real, technology makes it easier. And in fact, yesterday I was having a light conversation with Erica and Taya. So they said we got to get your permission for you to record this particular session. I said, that's great, but as long as you don't actually record my voice modularity and change it to a different frequency and have Erica's face here instead of me, so that when the AI system is trying to be me, it's not going to have all the data because it can take my facial expressions, it can take my voice modulations and create a whole presentation of things that I might not have never say in my life. And even for me as a person, it's going to be hard for me to figure out whether that's real or not. So in this particular case, this is a classic example of somebody going there and fraud, right? Literally trying to say, I'm going to sell this, and if they find out, it's great. I'm willing to take those consequences, or I'll figure out a way to get the best lawyers in town to protect me from this particular situation. So the question I have for all of us is, in our pursuit for glory, both personal success and organizational success, are we enabling an environment in which it's okay to succeed at all costs, even if it means creating those collateral damages? Right? And how do we reset and change that mindset? So from my perspective, since these things are happening, you have regulatory frameworks that we all rely on to keep us safe. But in most cases, these regulatory frameworks are always reactive. They're playing catch up. The regulators do not know how the Human Genome Project is going to affect FDA approvals, right? Because nobody is getting trained on those things. If there is an AI machine that's actually making decisions as a car is going down the road to say, am I going to protect and save the owner of the car in an accident? Or am I going to create collateral damage by actually moving that car into a building and killing 5 innocent people, right? These are the kinds of things that the legal framework can never get ahead and solve for it. So there are a lot of things that happen even in the face of all these things. In 2002, after the dot-com burst, I'm sure we have a person from WorldCom as well who's going to talk about it in like Enron. Accounting scandals, right? Sarbanes-Oxley was put in place to hold the CEO and the CFO accountable for the financial results that were being published. They could not hide behind the auditing firms. Great. 2010, after the 2008 financial crisis, we created a situation in which a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was started to protect consumers from predatory lending and things like that. Right? This is great, right? All of a sudden, there was an issue, regulation stepped in, we took care of it. Let's look ahead. How many of you have heard of Luckin Coffee? It's a coffee house where the chairman actually had like internal book dealings. He actually sold $310 million of something to his own company. Could have been flagged. Did not prevent it. Wirecard, $1.9 billion went missing. These regulations were put in place to protect that. Wells Fargo, right? Thinking about consumer financial protection. A bank was fined $3.7 billion for creating 2 million fake accounts and also opening accounts for people without their own knowledge. So the big message for me here is that there is so much of environmental damage, social damage, economic damage that's happening, and most of us seem to rely on regulation and legal stuff to actually protect and create a better world. The answer is, there are good places to start, but if you rely on those, these kinds of transgressions won't stop. It's like cybersecurity. Every time you find a way to fix a hole in your Safari or your browser and other things, these people are going to figure out different ways to get into the system. It's a cat and mouse game. So the answer has to be beyond legal stuff. What are the ethical, the moral issues that we need to be looking at? And how do we instill that kind of thinking into people, both as students, as employees, and as leaders? Until we get to that part, this situation is not going to change. And if it doesn't change, in our lifetime, we don't have a fighting chance of creating a world that focuses on shaping a brighter path for all. Because selfishness, personal interest is going to take over. If that's not enough, we have amazing technology that's coming up. CRISPR is going to allow us to have designer babies, right? It's got good and bad. CRISPR can help take away diseases like myopia, polio, all those things, right? Because you can use gene editing and make those things happen. At the same time, if I want a blue-eyed son, I can have a blue-eyed son. We don't know the ethical implications of what's going to happen to the gene pool when you keep going down this path. So now I'm actually moving away from just like transgressions to areas that create ethical dilemmas. There is no right solution. Would we not want to prevent so many things from happening? Given that 20% of our GDP is spent on healthcare, imagine the value that we can create with CRISPR if we can go into gene editing and prevent autism, dyslexia, cancer. That's a better life. But it also comes with a lot of other things that needs to be managed, ethical dilemmas. Same thing we talked about the self-driving cars, like how do you make those decisions? And then ultimately, knowledge as a curator. We talked about ChatGPT. If technology is going to come into your ears and tell you what's the answer to this question, which is great, but how do you know it's true? And AI is based on data. It can't tell the difference between what's relevant and what's right. So we find ourselves in a situation that is going to create more moral dilemmas in our world that go beyond just ethical transgressions. And we have to prepare for it. So from my perspective, in summary, while the awareness of ethical lapses and dilemmas have actually increased, people are talking about it today. But talk is cheap, talk is easy. But unless we take the stock and move into action, which leads to impact, we haven't done anything. So the question I have is, how do we get there? Prior to that, we got to understand, why is this happening? Is there excessive pressure to achieve unrealistic performance targets, both for an employee, the leader, right, as you're making these investments? Is it possible for anything to keep growing at 3% or 10% or 20% forever? If Amazon were to grow at 10% for the next 20 years, it's probably going to be bigger than the US economy, which is growing at 2%. Right? So at some point, we have to really stop thinking about growth from the perspective of top-line revenue growth. Right? How do you create organizations that are much more sustainable, that can create value for the community, the employees, and the customers, and doing it well is good. Second, misaligned incentives. If people are compensated based on a stock price, for example, there is every incentive to keep that number moving up and up. Previously, it made sense, because the stock value was tied to net present value of future cash flow. But in today's world, a lot of these businesses are not even profitable, which means there's no cash flow, there's no profitability, right? How do you value that company? You do that, and then you come back and say, here's why I looked at this multiple, that multiple. We make an emotional decision to say FTX is worth $40 billion and come back and justify it based on things that we can find. And then, positive example is not set by people leaders. We have kind of normalized that kind of behavior, right? I mean, like you had that happen with Uber. You, as the head of the organization, have a responsibility, right? You're not just like responsible for the strategy. You're responsible for shaping the culture. You're responsible for shaping the ethics that needs to be followed. And last but not the least, even when people are not doing those things, why aren't we empowering employees and other vendors to actually speak about these things? Because of retaliation, worried about losing jobs, we have made it unsafe for people to open up and have these conversations. So for us, if we have to find a solution, we have to address some of these things as well. So going back into the history of business itself, right? If you think about the 1800s, businesses were run by family. If I was running my family, say my great-great-great-grandfather was running this business, most of the people that worked in that business were family members, so which means you were going to be ethical, you're going to be taking care of them. You actually did business in a local community because you didn't have the internet, you couldn't be shipping things to Timbuktu, right? So you had like some kind of a moral thing that bound you together because these people and relationships meant something to you. That was the situation. 1900s is when public companies started to emerge. So at that point, that had thousands of shareholders, and the board of directors actually controlled the company and made those decisions. It was pretty interesting. After the Great Depression, there was a debate that happened between two amazing people, Adolph and Merrick. And Adolph focused on profits for shareholders as the vantage point from which businesses should be run. Merrick, on the other hand, and said, we got to be looking at customers, employees, and society. After this debate, Merrick won, and then managerial capitalism was born. During that period, you saw an increase in incomes for both leaders and employees in tandem. So today, when you look at it, in the 80s, we switched to investor-based capitalism, right, where investors were the most important person in the goal, and they were actually incentivizing people to say, let's tie the CEO compensation to the share price. When we went down that path, what happened was the average CEO salary today is about 370 times the average worker, and that moved up from 44. You can clearly see by having the wrong incentives in place, I'm not denying that this could also have some benefits, but just having the wrong incentives in place drives the wrong behavior. So when you are actually focused on the stock prices, you also start looking at short-termism. What can I do to ensure that the stock price goes up in the 4 years or 5 years I'm going to be CEO? And you're trying to optimize for that. And you would be expecting the board to be the one that's looking at 10, 15, 20 years of the organization because the boards are supposed to be the governors of this whole situation. But that's not happening today because the board is actually being controlled by the CEO, because even with Facebook today, because of the preferred voting rights and other things that are in place, Zuckerberg controls that company decisions. Think about what happened with Twitter. So in these situations, there is nobody that's actually looking out for the long-term interest of these organizations and creating a sustainable path. So now let's start solving for these things. So I just want people here to understand, unethical practices can happen to customers, employees, and competition. So when it comes to customers, we know about false product claims that have happened before. It could also be hidden terms in the end user agreements. How many of you here spend a lot of time reading end user license agreements? Right? You have no idea. It might say, you're actually giving away your newborn, the next newborn, your grandchildren away. And we all say yes, and we sign it. And then ultimately, unethical accounting practices, right? These are the three main things that we should be aware of. The next one is looking at unethical practices towards employees. Poor working conditions. Low wages, we talked about it, gender gap, those things. And ultimately, even in conditions where workers are working in unsafe conditions because it's a choice between life and livelihood. If you're hurting to feed your family, you know what? You're going to stomach all those things and work in a toxic environment. Because that kind of requires you to be in that situation. But shouldn't the people running the business look at it and say, how do I create an environment? If I had my own son working in this situation, would I allow this to happen? Going back to the whole family-oriented mindset. And so those are the kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves. Sexual harassment, I don't have to say anything, right? The Me Too movement just came out and everybody was involved. It's just like, it was surprising to see how deep and well established that network was. So these are some of the unethical practices that we've seen. And then from a competitor perspective, it's defamation, trade secret misappropriation, and bribery. So again, these are some cases self-explanatory, but defamation pretty much happens in the media world because you're actually suing somebody because they have a personality. But in this case, the example that I have here is about the Dominion vote machines. And Fox went after them. Even though they're not competitors, it can also happen because you're instigating other people to do your work. So keep that in mind as well. And then you have, with so much of technology running the world today, you had somebody from Google, Lewandowski, I think is his name, took the technology of self-driving machines from Google, went to Waymo, then passed it on to Uber, right? And this case was settled. So today, with intellectual property being one of the most critical issues that we have, we got to be careful about how our employees, our leaders are dealing with these situations. And last but not the least, we talked about Goldman Sachs, which is like the best firm from an ethics perspective. And hats off to them. I've known people there. They have those things, right? Even that organization was susceptible to what happened with 1MDB, which is a Malaysian situation. Almost like few $1 billion of bribe to get deals in Saudi Arabia to Malaysia. All these things happen. So even organizations that take the time and try to keep everything going the right way, bad things can happen. The next is the gray area, right? There are people look at it and say, oh, this is legal, but unethical practices. Selling customer data based on end user license agreement that nobody can understand, burying things in there. Creating complex securities. The mortgage-backed securities, which created the 2008 financial crisis, most people could not understand what was happening, even people in this industry. So how do you expect a layman to understand those things? And by putting those toxic securities out there, it's people's 401k money, right? That goes towards retirement, that gets invested in this. When a Bear Stearns goes belly up, imagine the number of people who've actually put their life and blood into that organization to make it successful, and they have actually left with nothing. So ultimately, unethical behavior can lead to damages. We know about that. It can also lead to penalties, including jail time, fines, and things like that. Most importantly, it can disrupt lives of people and communities. So now the question is, if you have to solve for all of these things, you cannot solve for it unless you know what is the problem that you're trying to solve for. So success lies in understanding these limitations and the problems that we're trying to solve, and how do we put together a solution that's going to work in those kinds of situations, especially in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. But also knowing fully well, there is no solution that is a perfect solution. Any solution, any incentive that we put in place will also have some negative implications. It's about knowing those limitations and saying that it's okay for me to take that, but here's how I'm going to mitigate those things. So the next part, we're going to be focusing on how do we then reset? So it starts with purpose and belief. Unless we believe that there is an opportunity to balance profit, people, and the planet, if you don't have that design principle in mind, it's very difficult to go back and create a structure that's going to help you achieve that objective. So when it comes to people, like how do we help communities? How do we create equity within those communities? How do I actually focus on the well-being of my community, because these are the people who are going to be buying my product 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line? How do I educate them, because these are the people that are going to be working in my office? We have to have that kind of thinking. When it comes to planet, you could be Pepsi, and you could be sitting there and saying, I'm actually going to take 2 liters of water to create half a liter of Pepsi. The question here is, what am I doing to renew that particular precious resource that we have? And based on what I'm hearing, we might run out of fresh, potable drinking water before we run out of oil. And then last but not the least, profit is important for us to create certain things, right? Nobody can be underwriting the costs. We can't be raising our debt ceiling every time we actually hit a limit, right? So at some point, we have to make things profitable as well. So for me, what do we need to do? How do we design systems that take into account other factors as you're making decisions? Because the way we are trained, including in business schools, is to take decisions based on financial factors. Oh, here's a model, let's do these things. But there is no line that says, what's the impact of this decision on my employees, long-term value, health, or my community, right? We don't have those frameworks yet, but I think we have the technology and the know-how to create those things. The second is, harm is inevitable in a number of cases. If you have a car that can take you from point A to point B, it helps. You can take your children to the hospital if needed. You can take them to school. It has benefits. But at the same time, it's also something that pollutes. So we have to come back and say, we know it creates pollution. How do I focus on technology that's going to drive down the pollution from, say, 20 to 10 to 5? And meanwhile, can I develop other technologies that can help me leapfrog and say, we don't need a car anymore, right? Transportation is going to be very different. So those are the kinds of thinkings that we need to have. And how do we have a commitment? This can be done. Pepsi did it with its Performance with a Purpose initiative that they had. So this was called Performance with a Purpose. They focused on 4 key areas. Financial sustainability being number 1, that's great. But the second one was much more about human sustainability. How do I actually reduce the sugar, salt, and fat in the products? Because as you're snacking on these food, you're actually taking in, it actually creates a health situation down the line. So Pepsi actually looked at it and said, I just want to minimize the number of ingredients that goes into the Lay's chip. This is a true story. They also invested in technology that actually spreads out salt on your Lay's chip in a way that's actually symmetrical so that every time you eat it, you have that same consistency. So technology allows you to take problems that you've had in the past, like over-salting, because people needed it, right? There was no way for you to spread that salt. So that technology was used to actually bring down the amount of salt that was required. And they actually used certain technologies to reduce the amount of water and reuse it when they were making those potato chips as well. Condensation, reusing of water, and things like that. So again, looking at it from a human sustainability point of view, from a health. Same thing from an environmental point of view. And last but not the least, they also figured out they didn't have enough women in workplaces, particularly in countries like Egypt, and certain markets. They actually went out and said, what can we do to attract these kinds of people into the organization? So ultimately, the big message is that if there is willingness at the top and there are people rallying around it, this can be done not just in new organizations, but in organizations like Pepsi that's been around for a really long time. The question here is, do we have the mindset to do it? And do we also have a leader that's willing to pound the table and say to the board and the investors that this is what we need to do? That's what we're looking for. As most of you here, my ask and request to you is, as you dive into the business world and make a mark, take the time to understand moral theories and ethical frameworks. You have amazing professors here from like Taya to Derek and all these people, right? Have these conversations. because these conversations are going to be relevant as we actually shape and retool for the 21st century. The second is, as you look at organizations, including those that you're applying for, look at the purpose. What is the purpose of this organization? If they talk about ESG, take a look at the data and say, is this lip service or greenwashing? Are they really integrating ESG into their thinking, their strategy, their execution, and the culture? Ask those questions, because the answers will become obvious and might avert you from actually ending up in the wrong type of organization, because they do exist. And then ultimately evaluate as you go into these organizations, what level of maturity do we have when it comes to culture and controls? Is this an organization where people speak up and I can have a candid discussion about things that are working and not working? Or is this an organization where people are scared to actually talk about things and just everybody's in their own silos and turning a blind eye to things that are pretty obvious? And then at some point, you're also going to become people leaders and organization leaders. How do you own culture and ethics in addition to strategy at the same level? How do you build the muscle to handle ethical dilemmas? Because there are going to be so many questions that you and I have to face that don't have easy answers. It's not black or white. There's going to be 50 shades of gray. And then ultimately, how do you create a culture of transparency and radical accountability within the organization? Not only to the organization, but the customers you serve, the communities you work, and the environment in which you're there. So that radical accountability is not just to the organization. And you have the opportunity to do it. So again, these are just like high-level ethical frameworks that I want you to think about. I'm sure you're going to learn much more when you're actually in classes with a lot of these people. There are 4 principal ethical perspectives, right? You can look at it from the perspective of an action. Was the action right or wrong? You killed somebody, right? They might say killing is bad, killing is good. But what if I gave you additional context to say, you know what, there was somebody who was actually affecting my family, doing all these things. They were going to kill my son. I killed that person, right? So all of a sudden, by providing more information and context, you can't just value something or evaluate something just based on action. The second one is agent. Who's the person doing it? Is this person really well known? Is he or she stuck to a moral standard? We look at it and say, you know what, this person cannot do any harm. But that might be a situation in which they actually had a blind side and did something wrong, right? And then ultimately, you can look at this from an outcome perspective, utilitarian concept. Hey, if 80% of the population are going to benefit from it, it's okay for me to affect 20%. That's okay. But again, that's another moral framework that is out there. And then ultimately, relationship-based. If you work in Japan and any of those cultures, you are expected to listen to your boss. You don't actually speak up in a meeting, right? So those are relationship-oriented perspective from which you can look at ethical situations. So ultimately, these 4 perspectives, action, agent, outcome, and relationships, gives you a way to navigate these situations. But it's only telling you what's happening, because you have to meld these perspectives to really get to an answer. And in some cases, you might encounter moral dilemmas as you go through that as well. So ultimately, when you actually walk into an organization, take a look at the ethical norms. What are the motives? What are the goals of the organization? Orientation towards law. How do they perceive law? And what's their strategy? Because an organization could be immoral, amoral, or they could be a moral management organization. And in most cases, the answer is always in the middle, right? There are a lot of immoral management where I do the bare minimum. When it comes to motives, the impact on others is not considered. I'm focused on profit. I'm not willingly going out and actually putting somebody at risk, but I choose to turn a blind eye and say, I'm actually going to pollute this particular Allegheny River here because the EPA standards say X, Y, and Z. It's going to have downstream impact, but I'm not worried about those things, right? So again, that's where ethical dilemmas start to emerge. And then finally, there are people who look at and say, the law is my standard. Anything required by law, I will get it done. Anything outside of that, I don't want to be involved with it. And then from a strategy perspective, if I get caught by the law, I'll pay a fine and move on, right? I would still continue to do immoral stuff. So use these frameworks to really understand the type of organization that you're working on. And if you are an entrepreneur starting these organizations, ensure that, what kinds of design principles I can put in place to ensure that, I'm creating a culture in which people, planet, and profits are being considered, and I create a framework in which great things can happen. So the question we have here is, are these organizations looking at a compliance approach, which is meeting the bar, versus is this an organization that's willing to have these conversations and raise the bar? So keep that in mind. And compliance is a strategy, but the integrity strategy works a lot better because now you're expecting people to do the right things in all situations, even though when there is not a manual that says, do this in this situation. As I bring this to a close, I am truly hopeful because there are multiple factors that have happened, right? The internet is both a blessing and a disguise, but it's a blessing because information and transparency, right? You know what's happening in the far corners of the world. And as we launch satellites into space, you know where there is pollution happening, where things are not. So the world is becoming a little bit more transparent with so much of data being available. And with employee and consumer activism leading the way, because each of us now have a megaphone, which is a Twitter or an Instagram and all those things, and people are willing to voice themselves as well. That's actually creating an environment in which great things can happen, on top of investor activism. So from my perspective, there are a number of examples of Netflix, like people walking out to what happened with Disney, to what happened with Victoria's Secrets, right, during the Me Too model, right, are all really good case examples of what can be done when there is an informed consumer and an informed employee. That can really change the world. So as I look to the world ahead, crises happen. Anytime there is a crisis or a structural change in this industry, there is a huge opportunity for us to reimagine and reshape a better future. And from my perspective, more so than ever before, we have the knowledge, the technology, and the tools. If we can wrap that with the right mindset, we can truly have a massive impact on the world and create a brighter future for all. We don't have to worry about K-shaped recovery. We can actually make this a more equitable world. And best wishes to you all as you go out and reimagine and reshape a better future for all. Sorry? Sure.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Sure, thank you.
I was sort of just thinking while you were speaking, something like the crash in 2008, you know, it started fine, like the mortgage-backed securities weren't that bad, like could be considered a good idea to begin with. But then the train was so far out of the station and all of these different parts, the rating agencies, the banks, everybody was like caught up in this party. And actually I think one of the CEOs, Vikram Pandit, said, as long as the music is playing, you can't stop dancing. Can something like that ever be stopped? And then maybe should it? Is it part of kind of a natural fluctuation? Because is that like in a completely different boat than something like just complete corporate fraud like Theranos or, you know, the FTX? Sorry, there was a lot of questions.
No, it's very clear. From my perspective, right, you always have to go back to the purpose. Why were these things created? So going back to the history of banking, right? So it started out with community banks because if you had money inside your mattress and your wardrobe, right, it's not creating value. So the first savings loan and other things, right? Community banks pooled in those money and then invested it back in the community. Today, money moves from here to China to like India to other markets, right, by the click of a button. So even though this would be the community that's saving it, that benefit is not being realized by the community. So we got to ask ourselves the question is, why do we need to create mortgage-backed securities that are CDO squared and CDO cubed? And if you look at it in most cases, it's because we want to make more money. Right? Ultimately, nobody asks the question, what additional benefit it's actually providing than just underwriting these mortgages? Because nobody wants to hold on to that risk, right? They create a product, move it on to the next person, the next person, the next person. So to me, the answer is, ask ourselves the question, did we need a CDO cube for this economy to function? Did that mortgage-backed security really improve the lives of people, right? And that's what we got to ask. And to me, the answer lies in that, and I'm not a financial expert, and I can certainly come back and say the world would have not struggled if it did not have a CDO square or a CDO cube. Yeah, what's the purpose, right? So in most cases, take a look at SPACs. How many of you know about SPACs here? Why was SPAC created? Any financial person here? Exactly, and make money, right? So what are you doing, right? You're not trying to bring quality companies into the market. Hey, you are a company that's going to take 10 years to get to the IPO market, but I have a SPAC, so you're a 2-year company which has like half-baked ideas. I can still take you public. So the answer is, what's the purpose? Does it help people, profit, or planet, right? Again, in this case, it's profit, and who does it help? Just that particular organization. So the answer becomes evident when you actually look at it from that purpose and that framework point of view.
All right. Thank you very much, Karthik. That was fantastic. We're at 10:15 now, so we'll have a short break till 10:30. We really appreciate